All right, I'm talking with Danny Wicentowski about investigative reporting, how he separates signal from noise, and what experience can teach you that you can't really learn about in advance. All right, so Danny, you work with a lot of students. You teach them how to do investigative reporting. When you are starting to work with a new group of students, what are some of their misunderstandings about how this all works?
Oh, that is a good question. Part of what is really difficult about investigation is we're describing the discovery of something new. We're describing an effort to remove a barrier, to elicit a story from someone they've never told before. And I think part of this really is that I think a lot of students think there is a trick. There's a first step to the investigation. Like, what is step one to getting someone to trust you? Well, you wear a blue shirt and you introduce your friend. No, like it is very complicated, and it is different in almost every scenario you're doing. I think that often what is consistent is that student journalists are doing their first investigations in journalism on a college campus or on an issue that is related to a college administrator, a class, a teacher. They are learning the mechanics of how large institutions are funded and position themselves during times of chaos or controversy. And so what I often find, though, is with students will be asking, how do I get this report? Or how do I get this person to talk with me? This is the element of an investigation, is the dead end. It is the basic building block of almost what is shaping how you pursue this information and where you go. And I think students often are coming to me as they describe this with some of their first experiences of running into that dead end. And often, like, what I have to help them understand is that, like, you might not be able to push through this one. You might have to really explore what are the other avenues. And the most difficult part, I think, of investigations is that some of them really take months and years. And students do not have that time. Their class is only 4 or 5 months. They need to get a project done by the end of the semester. They are operating under kind of this artificial time crunch that is almost like having an extra editor who doesn't care about the story and just it's. I tell student journalists that the way that you are operating now is the hardest it's going to ever be. Probably in some ways, the stories will never be more difficult than they are when you are dealing with teachers and administrators who don't think you're a real journalist. And you're working for a paper, your student paper that doesn't command, immediate respect or authority necessarily from, an economics professor or someone who doesn't think that students know what they're talking about. There's kind of a crisis of legitimacy that I think these student journalists are reckoning with in the first moments of their exploration of this technique. And I think that's really frustrating and difficult. And I think it burns a lot of folks out really fast, or turns them away from journalism completely. I think what I often end up doing is asking them to really zoom in on the stuff they have. Who are the sources who are talking with you? What haven't you really explored yet? Have you set someone to the side, thinking oh, once we get this department to comment, then I'm going to come back to these students? And I think you're ignoring the sources you already have. You got to get to know these people a little bit more. Can you go and that's when you start really asking, what experience can you start to generate from these sources and from these threads you have? Can they take you into that lab? Can they show you the emails that they've gotten? Often it is really just as simple as identifying the breadcrumbs they already have that they assumed that they just left to the side already. I find myself talking to students and really getting them to piece over the individuals they've spoken with. But I think the other side of this is that often investigations that require you to get that the number of deaths issued over addictions or overdoses in this particular dormitory for the last 5 years, that might not exist. That might be a record that is not public. That might be a piece of information that exists on some administrator's computer, and you will never get it unless you can get to that right person. What do you do then? What is your focus? What is the good you're giving to your readers? Is the question you then have to ask yourself. And the toughest thing is that the option that the student journalists often don't have is putting the story to the side for a bit. is letting it bake, letting some of these threads work, letting someone getting back in touch with the source a couple months down the line after they've gone through, reaching someone after they've left a position years later. The greatest tool that I think investigations really have is the process of time, and that people eventually leave these institutions, and that the people themselves, the sources themselves, become ready to tell the story. And sometimes that can be, an eye-opening moment for these students, but sometimes I think it is a difficult realization that they have to refocus, they have to work on something else, they have to let their skills continue to build before the story is ready. And that is a bitter pill that folks can swallow. But it is one that I think it really does pay off, because I think people who want to talk with you will find you. And you have to give them that time. You have to give them that opportunity. You're not showing them an abyss, for them to leap at. You're showing them a refuge. You're showing them there's going to be a person here that you can talk to when you're ready. I think it comes down to like what trust means and how you can build that. Does it mean like being gullible, like that you found a person who's willing to just do whatever, to tell you anything you ask? Or is it, a person who begins to realize, this source, that if they pass you information about like a bill that's happening or something happening in the office, and you don't burn them, and like, starting in those little things, having those conversations, actually talking with people over time without their expectation that you are extracting something. You care. You have to genuinely care about this issue. I want to know about how this particular prosecutor is abusing his authority and sexually harassing all the women in his office. I know that you can't go on the record to talk to me about this, but it is really important for me to understand how this abuse works and where the other damage might be happening, and I don't want this to come back on you. Like I had to spend, that's a real example, that I had to spend a long time getting trust from people in a very a very sensitive environment to talk about their employer and to talk about conduct of someone in law enforcement. That was a story where I really needed some people to move on. Like that story did not happen without people leaving that situation, having kind of a domino effect of one source coming forward, giving strength to others. And you have to be open, I think, as an investigative journalist, to figuring out what is the kind of trust that is within your reach, that you can build and showcase, and that's not just your words. They might really trust that like your paper is important and has that authority and has some of that lineage. Sometimes that can help, but often people trust a person. They don't trust a brand or an institution.
So how do you figure out if you've come upon a story that is a real story that you want to pursue, or if you've just come across background noise that isn't worth it?
Often it is a change in a pattern. Can you establish a pattern, and can you establish that something significant has changed? That seems kind of reductive, but often you really are looking of like an institution that's been around for decades is suddenly lost all of its funding, or suddenly had someone stolen, has been stealing from it this entire time. Did we ever really know what this institution was doing? I think the investigative stories that really trigger me, like in a good way, is a clarifying feeling. This is the society we're living in now, and it's the one we've always lived in. And we are getting closer to that, an actual relationship with the world around us through an investigation. That's what I really, really am drawn to. And those, I think, are some of the most difficult stories to find.
That's really interesting. I feel like a lot of times when people think about investigations, they think about like, oh, person committed sneaky, weird crime. Let's like figure this out. But you're saying what matters more is if that sort of smaller story reveals something bigger about our world.
Exactly. And I think part of it is that, very rarely is it just that one person committing crimes.
Right.
The real, I think, harm in our world, it's the product of hundreds of people, or untold thousands of people over hundreds of years. Like this building we're sitting in, this block we're on, all of these roads, like the way these roads are laid out, the way they were designed before cars happened. You can really start spreading out and trying to understand like what brought us to sit in this room in this way, and to have these windows set up. You could really look into almost every individual detail of our life around us and really wonder, what is the system that produced this? And often like that answer is there. And I think, some of those answers are things for historians or of architecture, I guess, in this case. But if we're trying to ask, like, why do so many people die on the road? Like that is why are traffic deaths in St. Louis so high persistently? Why are pedestrians and cyclists always seemingly at danger? Why is it that we spend so much money on maintaining these roads and yet these conditions persist? And that's a question of like, that's probably not one person like sitting in a room conniving away, but like, could it be hundreds of people over dozens of years who all kind of just kept writing, this is a problem that's not, this is for the next person. That's not for me. Like, oh, we were, this is the city plan that we've always relied on. Like, in a lot of ways, investigations are finding those points of the people who didn't ask questions about what they were doing. There is a reality. There are questions we can ask about power. There are things that groups of people could have done to make things better. And sometimes even like individual people. And that's where things really get, in an investigation in journalism, that's where you find your character. That's where you find that first quote. That's when that story really does come in together. And I think, again, this difficulty of how do you tell a story about a large system, about a lot of people, but we got to tell a story. We need that, our story to zoom in on one person at some point or a small group of people. How do we tell that? How do we use our talents as storytellers and the things that we get from things like movies and novels and fiction that help us get into someone else's life? And that's what I think is really incredible about investigations, is that at some point you have to decide, is this a story? Like the format of a narrative. And oh man, does that get really complicated, because real life just does not always fit into a narrative.
It doesn't always follow like a perfect hero's journey.
Sometimes there aren't 3 acts, sometimes there's 13. Sometimes you get to the ending, but it's not really the ending. And how do you get people to, and that's where we have a cliffhanger. That's where we have next time on this serial. Like we are engaging the parts of people's minds sometimes that you think the question is answered. And we've answered some of it, but we need you to stick around. We need you to be hooked into this. And I'm going to use a form of manipulation called selecting, I'm going to drop a few details here. I'm going to keep you invested. And I think that's the other, aspect of investigative journalism, is that you really got to have a good sense of what are the storytelling tools that really come to play here. And can you turn this investigation into a version of, the things that you saw in your favorite movie or your favorite book? Those might be the things that make your investigation work.
Have you ever sort of chased a lead and realized that you were chasing the wrong thing? Either you're chasing the wrong story entirely or the wrong aspect of it?
Yes. I'm currently involved in a story that I've been working on for a couple years, that I am... You're in the place of like, is the main character the main character? Is the conflict the conflict? And like these kind of sound reductive, but you really start to wonder, like, why don't I have a beginning, middle, and end? Like, why don't I know where this is going? You really start to think, like, have I missed the thread here? Sometimes, though, you really need to explain something complicated, and you need the right person. And one of the first long investigations I did in 2015 and 16 was about essentially a 3-strike sentencing rule in Missouri for drug crimes. And that's, referenced, if you get busted, for weed, you get busted for crack. And then on your third one, you're like, you have 2 drug convictions. Now we're going to put you in jail for decades without a possibility of parole. Your punishment has gone up to the point where we're judging someone potentially who is dealing drugs to the same way we are sentencing a murderer. That's a really significant and controversial and powerful part of the way that our criminal justice system works. And so I went really into this, in the way that this Missouri law worked. And without like burying you in the details of this, I had a number of people I'd spoken with, all of who had been labeled as prior and persistent drug offenders. And they had been sentenced to these unbelievably long sentences for crimes that were essentially either them being addicted to drugs themselves, or that they were engaged in a drug trade that, was keeping them and their families, fed, or, they were just making a bunch of money off of it. And it was just like economically a good decision. It felt like the right decision for them. And I had talked to people who some had been involved in violence, some had not, some were black, some were white, some involved crack or meth. And the question is, who is the first person the reader looks at? Is it someone who engages empathy, or is it someone who is like involved in the criminal justice system in a way that helps me explain these different criminal statutes and laws that have changed? I've got all this stuff I really want this reader to understand, because you won't understand this mess without understanding how we got here, and I want to show you how we maybe can get out. That's a lot of tasks that a story has to tell. And this particular investigation went through a couple drafts where essentially like the main character in one draft became the last person that you get to meet in the story. And like I had an editor essentially not only tell me this wasn't ready to be published, but like I really had to go back to the drawing board of like what this, what is the scope of this story? What is it really trying to explain? And that was really difficult. That was a disappointment. Obviously, like as just something I'd worked on and thought was going to run. But I learned so much from that, and like the story was better. And I think that is a difficult lesson. I think a lot of investigative journalists do learn, and journalists, is that like having to take a step back, being told your story's not ready is, a call to make it better, and is a call to like really figure it out. I have abandoned very few stories. I think they've either stuck around, I've waited for the right sources to come to the fore, developments happen. But thankfully I feel very lucky that I think there are a few stories that keep me up at night that fell apart for reasons that I was not in control of, where I thought I had found that investigation, and I realized something else was going on that I could not ascertain, and I was not going to get to the bottom of this, and I had to step away. But thankfully, rare occasions.
Yeah, how do you know if a story is ready to publish, or if you need to keep working at it and keep figuring out more about it, keep meeting more people?
I think you really have to figure out, does this story make a promise? Like in its, is it a promise about like the analysis of our numbers? Is it a promise about like, that this is a problem that might be about to be solved or is about to fall apart? You really have to be able to feel confident that you have satisfied the expectations that you've set. And I think that sounds kind of general, but I think that's what when, just like Chekhov's gun, when it's introduced at the beginning scene of a movie, it's got to go off at the end. What is that in your investigation, in your story? Is it and maybe that happens right in the first sentence or paragraph of it. Prisons say that they have upgraded their mental health services, and yet according to new records from county jails, the deaths have never been higher. Like you set up a strong contrast that you have to satisfy in some way. I think that could be a very good benchmark of once you come to the end of your story. Now you are kind of counting on your readers to get to the end of a story. That can be pretty difficult. That's a tall ask. But often, to me, it really comes through going over the story with the sources and getting a sense of their reaction and helping them understand what it is that I've put together and how their quotes are being used and how it's connected to the other folks. Like, this is part of the fact checking, but this is also kind of the temperature taking. Have I produced the story that I've promised? Have I uncovered what it is? If I can explain it to the person who is in the middle of the situation, then I can explain it to the reader, I think, as well, and help them understand where I've gone. And so that it is a feeling. I think this is also where having an editor, having other people around you who are not experts in this, if you are so deep into a subject, it can be really difficult to figure out, have I explained enough? Have I done the needed technical work to make this narrative sing, or have I confused someone? Have I done too many flashbacks? Like sometimes it is really, have I confused people about the basic chronology? Are there too many dates? Some of these things are really hard to figure out on your own after you've read it over and over again. You need that extra pair of eyes.
What kinds of things can be taught versus what kinds of things have to be learned on the job?
Ooh, that is just tough. I think we can teach folks, especially by example of looking, other investigations, encouraging students or investigative journalists to read a lot of news and really wonder. And I think, on that level, I think a student can be taught when you read a news story, when you are thinking, looking at examples, just how did they get this number? Why did they frame this conclusion this way? I think there's a phrase like reading for technique, which is I've heard before, and it's not always the most enjoyable way, but you really you're trying to deconstruct how they got this. And I think you could do this with a New York Times story. You could do this with a Wall Street, even the highest level. And I think sometimes those stories are good places to start because often I'm unsatisfied with the way they frame things. And I think a lot of folks are. Why did they include only this voice? Why is it located in this way? Why did they reintroduce this person this way? Is this story structure trying to build us to something? I think you can teach a lot by example, but also you really want students and folks to find the things that engage their sense of justice or injustice and their talents for creativity. Because you actually have to be interested in the story. You actually really have to be invested in crafting it in a way. And it's really not something that you can do in a paint by numbers method. In fact, that's kind of what makes it magical and personal for each individual journalist. This is going to be an incredibly tailored and almost bespoke look at this issue. And it's going to be through the perception of you, like a single journalist, perhaps. And so I think there is a great deal of, artistic satisfaction of getting to that point of feeling yeah, this is ready. I have figured out this ending. I figured out this balance. These are things that I feel internally, as I'm thinking about a story, often before it ever gets to the page or a conversation with an editor. There is kind of I don't know, a switch, but the temperature changes. And I start to really feel okay, I know, if you know where you're going and you kind of know where you're starting, that middle starts to twist itself up for you. And I say all that, but sometimes stories work the other way. You got to start from the middle and then you spread outward. And maybe, obviously, sometimes you want to start at your most dramatic moment. A lot of these feel as I'm listening to myself, questions you might ask about a movie or storyboarding, but the investigation is almost like a crash course in a complicated topic that your readers maybe have never heard from before. And every tool, the narrative, the people, this is how people internalize and learn and absorb wisdom even. And that is what makes these investigations, I think, so compelling, but also really make them difficult. And I think overall, these investigations are incredibly human. They are extremely, the best ones do not feel like they have been spat out by a government report. And I think that mess, of creativity, specificity, qualitative, quantitative, all of these things really come together in different ways. And I am impressed by every single one that actually comes into existence, because on the other hand, there is so many moments where it's so easy just to say, nah, this is too complicated. This gets us into the weeds. There's no way people are going to follow this story. There's always a reason to say no. And you got to stick with it.
Well, so that's interesting, because I feel like a lot of times when you think about investigation, you think about uncovering the actual facts. But what you're saying is there's the second element of chaos here, which is how are you going to present those facts in a way that's interesting, in a way that's clear? And I guess that makes me think a lot about your transition from print to audio, because surely there are differences in how you present a story.
There are. Yeah, I mean, this is something I'm still kind of learning about. And a lot of it is, kind of our physiology. How much information can we absorb through speaking alone versus writing, which is such, it is an abstract form of communication that somehow we've poured all of our sensory information. You can describe how something smells, how it tastes. You can skip time. You can move backwards and forwards across intangible things, a court case, a piece of paper, a meeting. Audio is sensory. It is not abstract. And the tools feel very different. And often I feel like the greatest issue is with numbers. Introducing years, introducing dates, percentages. Like there's so much to investigate that involves money, where you really often have to figure out, how do we zoom in on like one component of this? A Costco project that was built in University City, completed a couple years ago. I did a long investigation on that back in like 2018 or 2019, involving the use of eminent domain, where in different situations, governments can compel homeowners to sell their homes in order to make a development like a Costco actually work. It's an unusual situation where you have like the government saying it is in our city's interest to build this Costco, and we don't care that you live here. It's actually something that like I think upsets a lot of people when they learn about it, because you can basically be forced to move or forced to sell your home. Many numbers. You know, the developers are trying to finance things. There are city government meetings involving tax increment financing, which is another big chunk of money of how do these developments even happen? How do you get to a point where you can present your Costco to the University City Council and they're like, this is a really great plan. Yep, time to evict our residents. Like, time to take a politically damaging, potentially neighborhood destroying action. And so I did that story initially for the Riverfront Times and wrote a very long story and interviewed a bunch of residents, and I was able to get into all of the numbers and the estimates of how much things were supposed to cost and the way that those things changed over time and eroded the trust between the developers and the residents. But in the audio version, I spent a long time talking with people about like this strip of restaurants that was bulldozed to make way for this, and hearing about their memories of growing up with their kids. And like when you hear people talk about that, it brings you so much into like what this issue is and why people would fight to hold their communities together. And the numbers, sort of this abstract picture that in writing can really present a really compelling picture of just how much money is spent and how little consideration is given to the lives and of homeowners. That is much harder to explain in audio. And me just rattling off numbers isn't that compelling when you can hear someone talk about realizing that there's no one on the block to play with their kids anymore, or realizing that like they can look out the back door and see this Costco rising and the homes around them falling down. Like you can really, getting into those moments, you bring people into the part of the investigation that like in print is stuck in translation in a lot of ways. And so audio and visual mediums can often do an end run around all of the work that print journalism kind of has to do to engage empathy and, reading something and being able to kind of see a human face. Those shortcuts can be incredibly great sort of highways to bring people into an unusual story, because we all know what emotion looks like on a face. We know what someone's voice sounds like when it wavers as they describe their worry for their children. Those things can describe what thousands of words cannot. And I think it does really change the shape of these things. And I am still learning about it, but I'm also learning that when you engage the human capacity for empathy that is rooted in our senses and our touch and our organs and our body and something physical, that really exists in a different way than whatever's happening in our mind when we read.
Is there anything else you want to tell us about investigative reporting?
I think just the last piece is that I think that investigative reporting is an incredibly personal and a personalizing type of subject. Doing an investigation, you are bringing your own level of care. You are bringing your own concern for humanity. You are bringing, your own reaction to seeing someone else take a risk and put themselves out there. It's an emotional experience, an experience where you are chasing kind of your own curiosity and then having that curiosity crash against the need to quantify, to have some numbers, to figure out what kind of story that is. I think people can lead with their feelings when they're looking for these stories and where they're wondering, is this an investigation? The question of do I care about it is a really important one. And the question of, do I care about these people? Do they show something that I wish I could see more in the world? Even when that's a very difficult thing. I spent a long time talking to people who have become like whistleblowers over sexual abuse. And like, these are terrible situations. These are investigations in which often the end of the story might be more grim and a more clear-eyed view of the damage that has been done. But often, like, even in those situations, these are people who have taken control of their own lives and in the institutions around them, even if it's to smash them down. And I think overall, like, journalism and investigation is this counterpoint to apathy, is a counterpoint to the sense that this world just is the way it is, and that we are governed by larger forces and things that were started decades ago. We are just, we just have to lay back and let it run over us. You can see examples, the counterexamples of that almost everywhere. And I think there's something that journalists or reporters maybe need, is that we need more of that. We need more hope and more action in this world around us that is not performance, and that we can bring that to people. It takes work, and it is never quite as well formed as I think we think it is at the beginning. And I think that is a mark of reality.